Hello.
Hello.
Did we do it?
I don't know. I'm going on YouTube right now. Is it working?
I don't know.
It looks like
Hello?
it's working. It looks like it's just a couple seconds delayed, so the countdown is finishing now, as far as I can see. And there are two
Amazing.
people watching.
Amazing. We love it. Welcome to people who are watching.
Hello, hello. Hello there, even.
Oh, now you can hear me. Oh, there are 3 people watching now.
Yippee. Hello
Amazing.
and welcome.
Um, well, let's get right into it. Hello everybody who are joining hopefully now. Uh It's me, Sawyerism. We're back for another episode of the Star Wars Book Club, and I am here with my longest, oldest, dearest friend, Hannah, who you may know as Discount Bo-Katan.
Hello, how are you?
Well, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I just finished doing work at the elementary school and they would not quiet down today.
Oh,
So
goodness.
we're in an interesting sort of spot headspace wise of like, but I'm glad to be talking about something more fun.
Yes, Qui-Gon Ben says, "Woo!
Yay.
Hello, hello, hello." Qui-Gon Ben, feel free to bring your friends. Tell them we're live. I had a feeling that tonight's episode was not going to be quite as jam-packed as last time. I'm not sure why though, because everybody always tells me that Lost Stars is the best book they've ever read, let alone Star Wars book, and we will be talking about Lost Stars tonight. But no matter, because anyone who's interested can always come back and watch this later. If you are here, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up so we can get good ratings. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you're not already. But without further ado, let's get into our conversation about Lost Stars, because I have been wanting to read this book for many years now, and I finally, because of the book club, bit the bullet and said, let's do it. And Hannah happened to be reading it right around the time that I made this decision, so I was able to borrow her copy, and now we are
My
here. And
signed copy.
your signed copy,
You
yes,
want to
signed.
cameo the
Oh, I put it in my bookshelf, unfortunately. I don't have it with me, but yes, it is signed. Um and yeah, so we're going to talk about it. Let's just get right in with first impressions, non-spoiler thoughts. What are your initial thoughts about this book? And anyone in the live chat is free to, as last time, whenever we pose a question, it is a question for the entire panel. So if you have something you'd like to say about the book, please feel free to leave a comment and we will discuss it as well. But Hannah, what were your first impressions of this book?
It was my like subway book. I live in New York and so I take the subway and I just recently moved far away from where I work. So I've had a long commute lately. So I've been like eager to read more books to pass the time underground. And of the like 3 books that I've had be my subway books, this one was the only one that I was like very eagerly, like, okay, it's fine, like that I'm waiting 10 minutes for the train because I got this with me. And oh, good, this is my time to read that. Such an excellent book. I had a really great time reading it. I think that stories that center alternative perspectives in Star Wars are some of my absolute favorites. I always love like from the perspective of the Sith, from the perspective of the Night Sisters. I just, but in part, like, straying away from like the Jedi, the Rebels is always fun. But in particular, that sort of like inverted perspective that we get when we're like POV Empire is, I think, one of the most interesting. It's what, almost got me to play Battlefront because I heard that Iden was like, let's avenge the Emperor. I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I just am not quite enough of a gamer girl to have pulled the trigger on that one. But
I haven't even played that game actually.
yeah.
Or
But
not the campaign anyway.
oh yeah, well, I guess that's the thing that I was most interested in, and it's the thing that people play the least, right?
I would say yeah, it's mostly multiplayer.
Yeah, I
But
think that like it's just like what attracted me to it though, I guess, was like this kind of like alternative perspective. So this was like a great book for me, not only because I really love that sort of like, let's look at things from a different way, let's understand that, for a number of reasons that I'm sure we'll get into, that's like really interesting to me, but also you know, I love like a good solid sort of like ill-fated love story as well. It's sort of
Mhm.
like star-crossed lovers kind of thing.
I don't know if
Um,
I would call this ill-fated though.
but it's, you know, I guess it has that sort of like, for the majority of it, it's sort of like a ill-fated, doomed, you
That's
know,
fair. Yeah.
kind of love.
Um, yeah. Sophie says, I loved the book. I think Claudia Gray is my favorite Star Wars author. I would agree. I think Claudia Gray is absolutely phenomenal at what she does. She wrote my favorite Star Wars book, which is The Fallen Star, which is the third adult book in the High Republic Phase 1. And she's written so many other amazing books for the Star Wars universe. And I have not read all of them. So I'm looking forward to reading more now that I've tackled what is known very much to be her best work in the franchise. But yeah, I would agree with everything Hannah said. It was really interesting to dive into the original trilogy from a completely different perspective. And I had so much fun with the characters. They were so well rounded and well written. And I just absolutely fell in love with them immediately. I love how the pacing of this novel is. I think there's a lot of skipping, but I think it's done very thoughtfully and it flows really well together. And I loved the significance of their planet, Jalukan, and how that continues to be a recurring setting for their union and their
I
kind of
noticed about
Switzerland.
Yeah, I noticed about Jalukan. Actually, this is total side thing, real quick. But that I just started reading Bloodline, and
Oh.
I've stopped reading it for a second because I like my water bottle leaked on it while I was in my bag, and it's also a French coffee.
No.
And I got really upset, and I was like, I need to keep this away from my water bottle until I can calm down. And then I just never put it back in my bag. This is only a couple days ago, though. But Claudia name drops Jalukan within like the first chapter.
Oh my gosh. Um Yeah, and we get a lot of cameos in this book as well from some well-known either name drops or some well-known uh prominent figures within the Star Wars universe, which is really cool. Um but I did have a couple of questions. First of all, like how does this compare to other Star Wars books that you've read? Is this, for those of you in the chat, is this your favorite of Claudia Gray's works if you've read some of her other Star Wars books? And also, what was it like? I mean, Hannah touched on this a little bit, but I typically stay. I one of the reasons that I love the High Republic so much is because it's away from the main storyline of Star Wars that we're so familiar with. So I'm kind of curious, like, what are your thoughts on reading a book that is concurrent with the trilogy that started it all, and does that change things for you in comparison to reading something like the High Republic? So that's a lot of questions, that's a mouthful, but please, anyone is free to answer and share their thoughts on these things.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, so in terms of like my relationship with other Star Wars books and like how this compares to those, the only other Star Wars book that I have like read cover to cover is Light of the Jedi. And you know that I just like, I'm not a like a big reader of Star Wars books. I honestly like, I haven't been reading like until I started having this commute. I wasn't like reading that much anyway. I just finished like Slaughterhouse-Five, which is a book I've been like meaning to read for like 4 years.
What?
Yeah, I've never read it.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And it's like my dad and my siblings like favorite, you know, I had like my dad's copy from like grad school was like the one that I've had just sitting on my bookshelf, like staring at me, and I've been meaning to read it, and I'm finally fucking reading it. Sorry. I don't know. um, but basically, this I think was a good like, I think Light of the Jedi was a good like on ramp to the High Republic, but it didn't like turn me on to like reading Star Wars media, because it did like, while it does feel like Star Wars, it doesn't have that same thing where it's attached to the stories you already know, which gives it, I think, in the best possible way, sort of a fan fiction equality. Like in that way that like fan fiction is like addictive, and like it's like, oh yes, this is the thing that I already know and I already have a relationship, and this is a way to like enhance like what I already loved about that and engage with something that I'm already passionate about, like in particular. And so I guess I think that the amount of information that you have as like a Star Wars fan going into Lost Stars works definitely in your favor, because it helps you like highlight all of the irony of like the conflicting narratives of the like Imperial personnel versus what we understand of the narrative of the Rebel personnel, in a way that sort of challenges both perspectives, which I think is like really sick and fun. And I think it's something that like, you know, franchise books can do in a way that just like a novel sometimes like can't. You don't have like a baseline viewpoint on a story unless it's like a book like Wicked, name drop, where that it's like a, you know, intentional inversion of like a classic. This is sort of similar to that, and I think I like that kind of media for the same reason that I liked like Wicked.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely think there's an advantage to this book in particular, because when you're starting something like the High Republic, you kind of feel like you're taking on this massive undertaking because
Oh,
there are
it's
so many
scary.
books.
It's a
And
little bit like I'm at a point in this moment where it's like, yes, I read Light of the Jedi, but because I didn't immediately keep following it and keep up, I'm like, I'm overwhelmed. It's the same reason I can't get into X-Men. I'm like, there's too much happening.
I definitely think it's doable, but it is daunting. And with Lost Stars, if you even have just the very basic knowledge of the original trilogy, and even then you don't really need it. This is a standalone piece, and there's obviously room for a sequel if there ever were to be one, but there doesn't have to be. It stands alone, and I think it's frankly one of the only Star Wars books that stands alone as its own story that doesn't necessarily require you to have much background knowledge, which I think is really fantastic. Um, and so while the original trilogy is not my favorite era to explore within the Star Wars universe, it was really refreshing. And every time that we got to an event within the books that was reflective of what was happening during either A New Hope, Empire, or Return of the Jedi, it was just kind of a cheeky, like, oh, haha, yes, like, there we go. I know what's
Endor.
happening on Endor. Yeah. um, but anyway, let's get into the meat of it. Obviously, we have to talk about the two main characters, Thane Kyrell and Sienna Ree. What did you guys think of these characters? Did they serve as effective protagonists for you? They are the heart of the novel, literally. This is a love story, after all. Um, what do we think about them, their upbringing, their journey that they individually go on, and eventually, I want to say they eventually reach the same conclusion, but at the end, they still kind of are at odds. So,
Yeah. I think the most interesting thing about the way that Claudia Gray sets up these characters is by having Sienna, like, and we sort of talked about this a little bit
yeah.
the other day, but having Sienna come up in a very loving environment, so she has more positive associations with the Empire and like Jalukin as it pertains to the Empire, and closer relationships with, you know, people that she loves and trusts in her family that, you know, she believes also know best, that believe in the promise of the Empire, versus Thane, who, you know, has like a really fraught relationship with his family. Like, he doesn't have as many intensive ties to the system of belief that he was brought up in.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't go quite as deep. Obviously, they were both indoctrinated in a way that's like demonstrated really interestingly in that scene with Grand Moff Tarkin. But it's not like, it's just not the same, you know, when you're like brought up into a culture or a system of belief that you feel is loving and is positive in a lot of ways, it just like anchors you to it in a way that people who have miserable experiences, even when they're like tightly wrapped up in a like like when they're tightly like indoctrinated into something, if you're not loving it while you're there, yes, it's still hard to break out of it, but eventually I feel like my perspective is that those people are more likely to leave.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And that's something that I wouldn't have even considered had Hannah not brought that up when we were talking about it the other day. Um, I have this comment highlighted, but LJ Pin says, not enough romance novels in Star Wars, which is very true. And this is nothing if not a romance novel. And it gets hot and heavy in Lost Stars
But
in a lot of
also
ways.
like yes, it gets hot and heavy and it's excellent and it's like the things that you love, like that slow burn thing that you love, like out of your like romantic media, but also like it's like sharply political in a way that elevates it to the level and above the level of a lot of Star Wars media.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I agree with what you said, and I think it's so interesting. I love that we spend so much time on Jalukan exploring the relationship that Sienna has with her family and how it contrasts with Thane and his family. And I quite frankly, I knew going in how the story would divide. I basically knew the main beats of this book before I read it because I have so many friends that adore this book so much, and I knew the plot pretty much. But it was surprising to me because I didn't look at it the way that Hannah did. I was a little shocked to see that the cold, detached person who had no belief system was the one who was questioning the morals of the Empire first. I thought that was interesting, and that's not what I would have expected. And then we have Sienna, who grew up in a very loving environment, but she's so connected to the idea of oath keeping and what that means for a culture and an identity that she ends up sticking with the Empire until she doesn't have another choice. And they're at odds with each other throughout most of this book.
Well, I feel like what you're saying is probably like, in my opinion, intentional because I also did have some of that experience of like, oh, who's it going to be? I knew that one of them was going to be Rebel, one of them was going to be Empire, but I was like, oh, who's it going to be? And yeah, there was a lot of time where I was like, yeah, Sienna, like she's got that heart of gold thing that we come to characters. But you know, it's sort of like when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense why it wound up that way, just from like a psychological perspective. And it's a really, I think, skillful subversion of the tropes that we come to expect from like the whole Star Wars Empire Rebellion like dichotomy of having this character that at least my experience of her was that she's like, oh, she's more likable, she's more good, you know, and have her be the one who's on like the Imperial side, and that forces us to empathize with an Imperial in a way that we wouldn't have had to if it was like, I mean, you know, everyone rocks with like Sideburns. No, I'm forgetting the name. Rebels, Callus, Agent Callus. Everyone rocks with Callus. But it's not necessarily, it's, you know, it's sort of like in spite of his rough exterior. This is like a warm, loving person that you would normally sort of like latch onto in like, you know, she reminds me of like Rose a little bit, in the way that she's like an optimist and she's like leads with her heart, but she's also like smart. You know, you don't expect that to be your Imperial character. You expect that to be like your Rebel.
Yeah, and it's very interesting reading her perspective throughout the novel as she experiences the same atrocities that Thane is experiencing. Thane is looking at it through the lens of, oh God, where is our humanity? What is this tyrannical empire that I've joined, and what are they doing to innocent people? And the entire time, because the way that this book is structured, Thane and Sienna experience the exact same things more or less at every single corner, just through different lenses. And for Sienna, every single time we get to one of those events, first of all, we've already seen that through Thane's perspective. I noticed that throughout most of the book, we see what happens through Thane's eyes before we see it through Sienna's, and I think that that's intentional because we know the Empire are the bad guys. But then we turn around and we see it through Sienna's eyes, and every time, even as it gets worse and worse, she's trying to justify, oh, there has to be goodness here. There are good people. I have made friends here. They can't be bad people. Like, all the way to the very bitter end, even when she's very apathetic towards the idea of the Empire itself, it's still, you know, I have to, if there's nothing left, I have to have my honor. My honor still matters. Also, I love this LJ. And I see your profile picture. They do more than
Wow.
kiss. They do more than kiss. So I think you will be very happy with this book.
Yeah, that's the thing is that I was caught off guard by like I guess not. It felt like it fit, you know, it felt appropriate. But
Yeah.
I was like, there were moments. I mean, you know, I expected it to be implied that there was an intimate relationship. It was like not intensively described, but it was like, and then they like had sex, and then they went and they left and they went their separate ways or whatever, you know, like multiple times. Um, in like a more artful way than me trying to lay out the like sequence of events there, but you know, that it was like it was clear that that was what was happening in a way that I was not necessarily like expecting, which was fun and cool though, because it was executed in a way that I was like, ooh, you know, and like happy that it's like, oh, they're going for it, oh, they're going for it, you know. And then without it having to become like a fully R-rated novel, it's like we get what we want to get out of it. We hear about like
Yeah.
the emotional, we hear that they had sex, but also like the emotional side of that, and like sort of how they keep thinking back to it and like trying to, you know, reconcile that with like their political differences.
Yeah, absolutely. Sophie says, I loved seeing Sienna justifying the Empire's actions. It was a point I'd never thought of before. Yeah, absolutely. And it really puts into perspective that there can be good people on all sides of things and, you know, doing things for what they believe are the right reasons, but are unfortunately the very, very wrong reasons. And I think Claudia took on a challenge in writing that. And I think she did very well to showcase, because when you get a story that's as political as Lost Stars, you have to recognize that there are allegories to the real world and what's going on. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in a bit. But when you look at it that way, it no longer becomes fiction. And there are very real connections to things that happen in our real world when you're reading a book like this.
Yeah,
What else we got?
there was a lot. I mean, there were like multiple moments, especially where it was like talking about how the like the Empire was rationalizing like Alderaan in particular, that I was like, this is, you know, it felt like very present. There were like things that I was like immediately tying it to, and like looking at my own kind of, you know, ways that I've been shaped by propaganda like in my life. Very smart like political, you know, angles there, I think.
Yeah.
Like
Qui-Gon Ben says, for someone who had basically been given every opportunity to grow and succeed and have a place in the Empire, it's understandable how she didn't want to see the flaws. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that is a reality that we could all find ourselves in the right, under the right circumstances, which is a little startling to think about. But you're right. I mean, Sienna and Thane, they both worked their entire childhoods to become pilots and get to the academy. They both get placed at the top academy that is available for Imperial pilots, and then they become the top of their class at that academy. And they've worked so hard for this, and then it feels like there's nothing else, right? When you're just consistently getting rewarded. And that's where Sienna found herself up until the bitter end, where she is no longer interested really in what the Empire stands for. But I think she senses like, gosh, I've devoted my entire life to this. There can't be anything else. This has to be it. And so I have to still give it my all, which is sad. And obviously it doesn't end for her with the honor that she wants it to end, but I'm glad it doesn't. I am curious though. Do we think that this is a more effective love story than what we see in most of Star Wars? Because I think you can't think about Star Wars without love stories. They are inherent to what Star Wars is all about. And you know, we have Leia and Han. We have Padme and Anakin. We have, you can argue with the wall, Rey and Kylo Ren. We have Hera and Kanan. which I think Hera and Kanan is probably the best love story in Star
Well,
Wars.
here's the thing, because I was just thinking about Hera and Kanan in comparison
Mm-hmm.
to Thane and Sienna. I think that they have so much room and space to explore the relationship in Lost Stars
Mm-hmm.
that anything you spend more time with is just going to resonate like more clearly with people.
Yeah.
I did not, when I was watching Rebels, did not understand that Hera and Kanan were in a relationship until very late into the show, which they weren't really like making it explicit. You know, I was like, oh, these two have a flirty repartee. But they weren't like particularly making it explicit until like a couple of episodes before Kanan's gone, in order to like, you know, make you understand the reaction Hera's gonna have, make you have like higher stakes in caring about this character because it's deepening like the relationships that you already know he has with the other characters. That I think that basically like the way that we get love stories in other like Star Wars media is very much as like a B plot, you know, or like a background thing, or like a symptom of the plot, which is how I feel about Kanan and Kara, Kanan and Hera. I can't say the names of any Rebels characters tonight. Kanan and Hera, I think like it makes a lot of sense when it does happen, but it's like, oh, that was just like an output of the story that sort of eventually like came to pass the way I saw it. But this is like, because there's so much focus on it and we spend all of our time with these two characters,
Mm-hmm.
it works better. You know, it works better in terms of like developing the romance than most other Star Wars media. I mean, I think the only other time that we see like a romance that's spotlighted as it like explicitly and as like with as much time is probably like Padme and Anakin, and that's just not a relationship that resonates for me. Like in a, you know, it's like just a combination of like, I guess the actors don't have chemistry and the script is like that didn't make sense. Like the, you know, flirting is like uncomfortable. It's hard to buy in the same way, even because we're spending so, I mean, or even though we're spending so much time with those two characters and like growing their relationship, I think that it's like seeing something that's written so well and is a central focus of the story is new for Star Wars.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Qui-Gon Ben says, I think because it's a novel, they have advantages that shows and movies don't have. And I agree with that as well. It is more believable, I think, than some of the other Star Wars romances because we have time to explore. And I think that something that Claudia Gray excels at in all of her writing is character work. And because of the character work that she does with these two, it is never, you're never questioning whether or not they love each other. They love each other so intimately and so purely that even when they're at opposite ends of the war, they're constantly thinking about each other. They're constantly imagining that the other is in the room with them. Like the love is very apparent throughout the entire story. I'm curious about this comment, Jordan, because you say you don't think we've seen such an exploration of an evil couple. Are you calling Thane and Sienna an evil couple? Because I don't know that I would agree with that necessarily. Especially
they're not a couple until at least one of them has left the Empire.
Yeah, and for me, I we can talk about this a little bit. But for me, it was a little hard to jump on board with Thane's defection so quickly. It seemed like he was up and out of there way faster than I expected him to be. And it took a little while for me to be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I think that because there was not that much like tying him to there, because his main thing, I mean, I think he joined the Imperial Academy in the same way that Luke was going to join the Imperial Academy, you know?
He just wanted to fly.
Yeah, he just wanted to fly. He just wanted to leave. That's Luke's whole thing also. And I think that's also a really important thing about Thane is that he is Luke in another world. You know, like he's born on the same day as Luke. Literally, they are born on the same day. They both just want to leave and they're like considering joining the Imperial Academy in order to accomplish their goal of getting off
Mhm.
like a dump planet. So I think and then, you know, like Thane goes on to have like one-sided beef with Luke because he's like the golden boy. I think that it's really like interesting that he's sort of like drawn up in so many parallels to Luke. That
Mhm.
you know, but basically, like I think that you know Luke switching up and joining the rebellion was like, oh, I didn't know I had this option, versus Thane leaving the Empire was a little bit less like, yeah, I mean, it wasn't pro rebellion, it was just anti Empire. For a long time, he was like, I still think the rebels are terrorists, which is what he was, you know, like conditioned to believe through the propaganda that the Empire disseminates. But it's like, you know, I feel like because he didn't jump right to right to rebel, and because there wasn't that much that made him believe in the Empire, and also because he was pissed with the Empire in the first place for like driving a wedge between him and Sienna.
Mhm.
I think that to me it wasn't like strange. It was definitely like, oh, he saw something fucked. Sorry, he saw something like, you know, deeply disturbing, and he didn't even think twice about it, which I think is an idealistic way of you know, approaching like defection. But ultimately, I didn't feel like it was jarringly simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. My mom's like, "Are you still on your book club?" And I'm like, "Yes, mom, it's half
No, you've been
over."
here for half
But
an hour.
I know. But speaking of which, guys, tell your friends that we're live and we're hanging out and we're talking about Lost Stars. Um because we're having fun over here. And don't forget to give this video a like. Thank you. Anyways, yeah, I never honestly I didn't draw that many parallels. I think there are now that you say that. I think there are parallels
It's not
between
like strong, but it's, you know,
yeah. Um, but it's interesting that you say that, especially because Thane is so, oh my god, he hates the Force. He is so not into the idea of the Force. And I honestly, I don't know about y'all, I cried when when he was talking about mourning and him going through the I frankly, I cried when he showed up to stand vigil with Sienna and her father. That I was not expecting at all. I think that might be my favorite part of the entire book. That was
that was really
incredible. I
sweet.
was like, "Whoa." And it really made me just love Thane as a character. And you know, this book is about honor and what honor is, and no one has more honor than Thane Kyrell in this
Mhm,
novel. Unfortunately, if Sienna Ree were here, she'd be very disappointed to hear me say that. But
mhm,
it is true. We spend the entire book with Sienna wanting to uphold her honor, but it's really Thane who has the most honor and integrity, I think. And if I had to pick one, honestly, I think Thane is my favorite of the two.
oh, wow.
Yeah. But and it's because of acts like that. It's because I wasn't expecting him to show up for the vigil. I was so shocked when he was there, and when he continues to honor the traditions of the valley,
Mm,
to
yeah,
mourn the
the
dead.
armband, the morning stuff, the meditation, that was like, wow, okay, like
Yeah.
that was, I think, a sort of a turning point for him character-wise, which is nice because oftentimes in these stories you see one character changing and then the other one, or I guess I think it's like the Grease problem, right? Where it's like the woman changes to meet the man where he's at or
Mhm.
whatever. Or just, you know, oftentimes it's just like one character, I guess, has to put aside like their way of living and admit they were wrong and run into the arms of the other one who's waiting for them. You know, like I think they both sort of fundamentally changed each other, with Sienna, you know, giving Thane that sort of like the heart, the like the it's not the heart. I'm struggling to like explain how him wearing the armband for her and like learning to meditate in her honor and stuff like that, and like, you know, doing those things to try to be appreciative of like the Jalukani thing, um are like a way that she impacted and changed him in sort of like a fundamental way, like in his belief system. And then him leaving rocks Sienna's entire world. So I guess like it's nice that he has to shift his perspective for her, you know, so that they're both sort of equally altered, maybe not equally altered, but both, you know, meaningfully altered by their relationship with one another.
Yeah. Qui-Gon Ben asks, is the only difference between rebels and terrorists perspective?
I have a lot of thoughts on this whole thing with like the Empire and the spinning of the narrative, but do you want to say anything about it?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so basically, I think that I mean, it's easy for in Star Wars media for it to be like, oh yeah, like the Empire is obviously calling the rebels terrorists, but I think for us to sit with that information and to have as much back and forth as we can about like, I mean, as much back and forth as we do about like, wait, how did they? I don't understand how my government, who I thought was like good and who I've been fighting for, how could they have destroyed Alderaan? And then having that retroactively justified by like the destruction of the Death Star, so having it be a convenient narrative of terrorism, I think is, you know, I think that's highly relevant. I think that spinning things to fit like a certain narrative based on like, well, we need to justify this thing that we do, is like, I think it was startlingly like political to me, because, you know, Star Wars is always political, but this felt like incredibly like modern. And, you know, I mean, I'll come out and say it. I was thinking about the way that like the media has covered like Israel, Palestine, Hamas, the whole thing, and how it's like everyone's calling the, you know, like going back and forth on, well, this justified this and this justified this and this justified this. And I, you know, like you sort of look at them do that in that fictionalized setting and be like, oh wow, like, okay, this is reflecting something that is real, is in like our media, like our news media, and it makes you kind of go like, ooh, you know.
Yeah. And I think that's true of any war, or any
Yeah.
conflict rather.
I think, yeah, geopolitics does that all the time, but I think just like I was connecting it to the thing that's like coming up on my
Current. Yeah, for sure.
New York Times feed like every 2 days.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess for sure because you're reading it now and that's what's relevant to us, but
Yeah.
absolutely. And it is interesting how there's so much dialogue in this book regarding the rebels as a terror cell. And that's not the first time I've seen that in Star Wars, but it's interesting, especially like Thane's journey. He starts off calling the rebels terrorists, and then he joins the Rebel Alliance because he realizes that he stands for the fight that they're trying to fight. But then you have somebody like Nash Windrider, who is, in every sense of the word, a radical. And he takes that terrorism train all the way to the very, very, very end of the book, where he wants to avenge Sienna, who he believes is dead, and snuff out this new republic that has formed in the wake of the war ending. And what an interesting way to end the book, but we can talk about that in a little bit. But we really do see all flavors of that propaganda, of the ways in which different sides of a war will frame the conflict that is happening. And honestly, I think that the narrative muddles it a little bit because you're having to sympathize with an Imperial throughout most of the book.
Yeah, I think it brings nuance to those sort of like geopolitical things that it's clearly like connecting to, because it is real in the way that it's like it is like truthful in the way that it's like, yeah, like genuinely good people who thought they were doing the right thing died on the Death Star. Can we justify that? You know, whereas the movies move right past it. This is some, you know, I mean, like you could argue that that could be like inspired by, you know, like the end of World War II with like Hiroshima. It's like you could make that comparison too. Okay, it ended the war. Was that justified? Those people did nothing, you know, like those kinds of big questions that we have to sit with as like citizens of the world. That was like, I felt like very much invoked. You know, we're told that this is a righteous thing, but also, you know, ultimately, like, that's because we were seeing it from the perspective of the rebels on that like end of things. Now we have to look at it and see how the loss of Jude impacts like the whole cast of characters so deeply. And the same thing with Alderaan and not Nash Windrider being like Alderanian. So interesting in the way that he hard compartmentalizes in the end, you know? Hard.
And especially the scene with him and Sienna, and she's like, oh my god, they built another Death Star. I can't believe they built another Death Star. Nash, aren't you upset about this? And he's like, no, we need to destroy more worlds. And it's like, what? How did we get here? But you kind of see how he gets there. And it's meant to show you how easily the right dose of propaganda can radicalize somebody. And I think we really do, with all of the characters in this book, see the different variations of what this kind of propaganda and this regime does to you. You know, because we do have characters as well, like Jude, who were good-natured individuals who all she cared about was science. She was just in it for the science. And she lost her life when the Death Star exploded, and she was not an evil-natured individual. But and then I don't know. There's so much to say about this book. Oh my gosh. Qui-Gon Ben says, I think it's authentic to what inspired the rebels and the Empire in the first place, looking at the guerrilla conflict in Vietnam being an allegory for the Galactic Civil War. Yeah, absolutely. But imagine Claudia Gray writing this book in the early 2010s, and I mean,
she probably would have been writing it, like,
what?
I'm thinking, you know, like she probably would have been writing it in what, 2015? What is happening geopolitically in 2015? Is that still Arab Spring? Like what's
I think so.
So
but you know, it's very clear that she wasn't. I'm frankly, I'm not sure you're able to write a book this political without drawing from what's currently happening in your real world while you're writing it. And I definitely don't think it was a case of her just going back to the original trilogy and looking at Vietnam.
But I think that that's also entirely possible, you know, because I
would love to have a conversation with her about that.
Yeah. I think that's like a very close, you know, I think that's a pretty good one-to-one with the rebels being inspired to an extent by the Viet Cong, who have been deeply spun into like the communist terrorist evil by the American like narrative. I think that that's entirely possible. Yeah, and also like what was happening, like were we still in Afghanistan at that point? You know,
I don't know.
I think we were in Afghanistan until Biden. So
I think you're right. Yeah. Wow, I should have expected we would get so deep, but I wasn't ready for it.
That's the thing though with like I think it's easy to talk about Star Wars and to focus on lore and to focus on like the politics of this fictional universe, but I think it's also like I think that can sometimes be a mistake because we don't consume media in a vacuum, and art is intended, not just George Lucas's intent, like almost all art is intended to interface with the way that we live. Some of it is purely escapist media. Star Wars is not that. Very little science fiction is purely escapist media. Not to call Star Wars purely science fiction because I know people have problems with that, but you know, I think that it's like I feel like that's a lot of why these stories are written, and it's very easy for us to be like, well, we don't want to ruffle any feathers, so we're not going to talk about that part, and pretend like it's not, I guess, having that like impact on the way that we engage with it.
Yeah, for sure. It's so interesting how history all rhymes. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate how much history rhymes, isn't it? But of course, Star Wars is inherently political. It always has been and it always will be. And so long as we have new Star Wars to discuss, we are going to relate it back to what's happening in our current world. And that is especially true of pieces like Lost Stars and Andor. And
I'm so worried about watching Andor and our rapidly degrading democracy. I'm like,
I feel it makes me feel optimistic because I think whatever season 2 of Andor is going to bring is going to be at a time where we need to hear it most. So I feel optimistic. And honestly, I think that it's important to it is very easy to get lost in the whimsy of Star Wars, especially because it is space fantasy more than it is science fiction. But I think that as responsible Star Wars fans, it is important to tie yourselves back to stories like this from time to time, because Star Wars started as a political allegory, and that is one of the major things that George Lucas intended for it to be. And I think that there is a responsible way to engage with media, and so I'm glad that we're having this conversation because I think we're tackling it in that way.
yeah, it's a really, like, I think, good piece to read if you are sort of feeling distraught about, like, like the state of the world, of your country, of whatever, because it's just so, like, I guess, incredibly nuanced, but also like eye-opening about certain things. And it's really important, I think, to have these stories that are from the perspective of the system of government that is losing its way, or that has already lost its way, but people are not yet understanding that it's lost its way. I mean, lost its way is a loose term. Like, it is by design that the empire is like a fascist system of government. But like, I don't know. I feel like its nuances, its superpower, and its perspective of centering this bad guy force is its superpower, because it forces you to realize that you could live in something like that, and that like, it's not a myth, it's not a fantasy. It's people around the world live under authoritarianism to this day. They got there somehow.
Yeah, not to be dark and
Yeah.
dismal, but it is true. That reminds me of a scene in the book that I find so chilling, which is when Sienna finally lays eyes on the Emperor for the first time. And she's describing first what she knows him to look like from the Hollows, which is his pre Mace Windu fight senatorial.
So crazy that they say specifically that they still use that picture.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah. And then she sees the Emperor as he is, and he is frail and unnaturally pale, and as we all know, disfigured from his own Force lightning. And that, I think, is the moment where it really all crumbles for her, because she's already like, oh my god, they built another Death Star. But then she sees the Emperor and she's like, wait, all of this is a show for him. And he himself is a show for him. And everything that we do is a show for him. And that's, I think, there's just so many fantastic scenes in this book. But that one in particular stands out to me because she's realizing in real time how this giant, masterfully fabricated lie she's been living is all to appease one man who has all the power in the galaxy. Which
I also think it's a very wise canonical decision on Claudia Gray's part to have, like, all of the propaganda show, Palpatine as he was under democracy. Because you look at this clearly, like, the character design of Palpatine is so good, but it's also so clearly villainous. Like, you can't mistake that for, like, a benevolent dictator. it's rough. And it's like, I had always sort of wondered, oh, do people like not have a face to the name, or but it makes so much sense that it's like, yeah, remember this guy that you liked from when we had democracy, and then he wisely decided that we shouldn't have democracy anymore. Well, he's still the same guy, like sort of painted
Mm-hmm.
in that manner. And
Yeah.
it's like, I'm trying to think about, aren't there only like 4 official photos of like Kim Jong Un or so? Like
Yeah, there are not very many of them anyway. He's very selective about his presentation to the public. Um but that's so interesting. It kind of reminds me of, and this is not remotely the same, but it reminds me of the original novelization of the first Star Wars book,
Mm.
or the first Star Wars, like the novelization of A New Hope, essentially, which writes in the prologue that the Emperor was unknowing of everything that was all the corruption that was happening in the Empire. They write that his advisors are doing the corruption, and the Emperor is just this benevolent guy who thinks he's doing the right things and is not aware of the corruption, which is evidently not the canon that George Lucas decided to go with for the rest of his story. But that is how it was written originally, and that reminds me of that, because
No,
that's
I
kind
rock
of
with that a lot. I rock with that as propaganda.
true. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Um, but yeah. Um, gosh. Well, I do have one last question that I would love to ask everyone. But before that, are there any other scenes or moments or themes within Lost Stars that you would like to discuss that we haven't gotten to yet?
I know there is.
I mean, we could probably talk about this book for hours if we were really to sit here and think about everything that happens, because there
Yeah.
is a lot. It's a long book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love Jude.
Yes.
Um,
Our science girly.
our science girly, gone too soon. I think that you couldn't have picked a better character to become the martyr of the book.
Mhm.
Specifically a martyr in a way that we are already predisposed to like dismiss the martyrdom of. It makes you second guess yourself. Having Jude be so lovable and also quirked up, and like, like she's very into the Empire, but also, like ultimately, like she's good at heart. She works really hard to like, you know, show that Thane and Sienna, like neither of them are the guilty party for like
Yeah.
job, like her heart seemingly is very much in the right place, and yet she's a stickler for regulation, and yet
Mhm.
she's, like, but she's whip smart, she's sweet, she's like, I think, like a very interesting character who's different from everyone else, who brings that sort of like, not even quite bookworm, but like the socially awkward and lovable quality. Um, and yet she's hot, and there's just so many like fun things about her. And then for her to be the one who they both have to be like, oh damn, the rebellion murdered her. I think that was really well executed.
Yeah, I agree. And this is a perfect segue for Qui-Gon Ben's comment that the destruction of the Death Star was such a fascinating experience in this book. And I
And the way that
totally agree.
Sienna just like narrowly avoided it.
Oh yeah. All of that happens so quickly, and in like the succession of Thane being sent to another world, and then Sienna, she docks on the Death Star, she leaves the Death Star, all of a sudden the Death Star goes blank. Like that just happens very, very quickly. But yeah, such a different experience from, because it's an epic heroic moment when you're watching it in A New Hope. Oh my god, the rebels, they had no chance, but they did it. They destroyed the Death Star. It puts it in a very different framework.
It's chilling when it
It
happens.
is, yeah. And it's done masterfully, of course. And then Sophie here says that towards the end, Sienna just wants to die, and it reminded me of how the dark side corrupts everything. Even though she isn't evil, she's helping an evil regime, and it takes a toll on her. Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of ties into the last question I wanted to pose, because this book is not about the Force. The book is not about the Jedi, it's not about the Sith, it's not about this mystical thing that drives the inner workings of the galaxy. However, the Force still plays a pivotal role in this story in one way or another. So I was curious what everybody thought about the Force in this novel and whether or not it's used effectively, because we're not looking at it through the lens of a Jedi who is all powerful and can do these crazy moves and has a lightsaber, but we're looking at it through a cynic who doesn't believe in the Force and someone who doesn't necessarily understand it but does have a strong belief that it controls or has an influence on everything in the world. So I would love to spend our last few minutes here talking about that, because I think that it actually, in its own way, is a character in this book in a way that I wouldn't have expected a story about two Imperial pilots to be.
I think what I'm remembering most from the Force is like, hey, it's destiny, you know, like that kind of like idea about it, as the Force as like that sort of God's will kind of version of itself, you know, like the version of itself that's sort of like to an extent intelligent design rather than a tool or whatever. That keeps bringing these two people back together. I think that's, to be honest, it wasn't as prominent for me in my reading of it. Maybe I was just like missing things. What was your experience of that?
I think just it was constantly brought up, especially for Thane. There are everyone in his life, everyone, as the more radicalized he becomes in the rebellion, the more people say, "May the Force be with you," and they talk about Luke Skywalker and, "Oh my God, did you hear he's becoming a Jedi Master?" and this and that. And I'm a Spooky Kitty says hi, hello, thanks for stopping by. And then there's Sienna, who's constantly like, the Force, like, it brings us together, and the Force has a way of doing things, and it's the Force, and it's that and that. And Thane is very much like, I don't believe in that. But I think that because of I have the context as a Star Wars fan, and as someone who is typically more drawn to stories that are about the Force, I think it was very prominent for me in the sense that it was hard to ignore the fates aligning, and hard to ignore that it was a very real possibility that, I mean, because what are the chances that they end up in the same dogfight
constantly, over and
over they end up in the same place at the same time? But that, especially the dogfight over Endor, or not over Endor, before I think Endor, the dogfight where Sienna's told by her superior to leave one survivor. What are the chances that they would end up in that same fight? And what are the chances that they would, you know, cross paths and hear each other over the comms? And what are the chances that at the end of the book, the Corona Squadron would board the Star Destroyer that Sienna happened to be the captain of? You know, like, how, there's nothing else but the Force that this could possibly be. And I just thought it was an interesting way to look at it. And this is something that I think is actually missing from Andor, because Andor is very much absolved of the Force and the inner workings of the Force, intentionally so. And I don't think it does it a disservice by any means. It's just a different perspective on the world. But I thought it was just interesting to have the Force, at least for me, it was very much a forefront theme throughout the book, but we weren't looking at it through people who could use or understand the Force in its entirety, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that I guess that then for me, it ties back mostly to what I was trying to articulate before about how like they each impact each other. I think she makes him more spiritual. And so the Force is something that's connected to him in some ways to Sienna, in just her sort of like being a little bit more spiritual than he is, and her death having that impact on him.
Yeah, I think that, honestly, I think that the Force has more of an impact on Thane than it does on Sienna.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I still honestly at the end of the novel, I'm not convinced that he believes in the Force. I don't think that that's ever a bridge that he crosses, but I do think the Force guides Thane's journey a little bit. Also, even in just the timing, right? Like he goes to do that medical transport job and he runs into Wedge Antilles. Like there are just things the Force. It to me, I felt very strongly that the Force was guiding Thane Kyrell throughout this entire novel.
Right place, right time. Yeah,
playing a little bit of a joke on him because he doesn't believe in it. But I guess lastly, just to tie things in a nice little bow, what did you think about the ending? Because I have mixed feelings.
Okay, can I say this is how I thought The Rise of Skywalker was gonna end, and so it's nice to see it work for somebody. But I think her going down with like trying to go out in a blaze of glory was just such like an effective climax of the book. And so so incredibly visual, like with everything burning around them, and then he has to like fight her into saving herself, and she doesn't even want to be saved, and like they've still got a long way to go by the time the book ends, but they're like they're at a place of peace with it, especially because she's like, okay, well, I'm going to pay the price. And then he's like, no, ultimately, like, you're going to be forgiven. And she doesn't understand how she will be. Like, I can't remember if I need corroboration on this, actually, because I don't remember if I'm pulling something like accurately, but I seem to recall her being like in disbelief that the rebellion and the New Republic are going to be like understanding and forgiving, because that's not something she's like particularly used to from having spent so much time in the Empire. Is that something that's like textual, or am I just like reading into that? I don't remember. And you have my copy.
Wait, say again?
I seem to remember that there is a time where he tells her like, no, I think the New Republic's going to pardon you. They have bigger fish to fry. And I seem to remember her being like stunned that they like practice forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, she talks about how, and this is great because I literally finished the book like 30 minutes before we went live. But I read this book in 5 days, y'all. And you know what? For it being a 551-page book, I think that's a pretty impressive feat. But yeah, she is surprised by their hospitality. And she's got a nice bed, or like a relatively comfortable bed, and they're allowing her to have leisure activities while she's in her cell. She's allowed to have outside time. She's allowed to socialize. She's allowed to have visitors in her cell. Like there's all of this. She was expecting to be interrogated and tortured, and that's not what the New Republic is doing.
Right.
And yeah, so I didn't get the impression that Thane was sure she would get out early. I think he was not so sure of that himself, because we see at the end when he realizes that she's getting captured, he's kind of shocked by that. He's like, oh no, what have I done? They're not going to see this the way that I see this. They're going to see this as New Republic Rangers and arrest this war criminal, which is what happens. But, I think it is very ambiguous, but I think the biggest part of this is that no matter if she's going to be in prison for 5 years or 20, he's going to wait for her, and they're going to have their happily ever after anyway. Which, like you said, you're glad it happened to somebody, and I think that we're meant to take that as a hopeful, like, okay, they are going to be together in the end. But I was more curious about that. That's not where the book ends. The book ends with a very vengeful Nash Windrider.
Oh, right. Well, yes. And the birth of the First Order.
And the birth of the First Order, yeah. And I didn't love that, to be honest. I understand that this was like before the Force Awakens book, and that's how it was advertised because it ends with the Battle of Jakku.
Mm.
But I don't know. I mean, he was giving General Hux to me at that point. He was giving Neville from iCarly, like, you will rue the day.
I think that it makes sense to. Here's the thing: is that this book is at its core, it's like it's like deeply sort of brutally realistic, even though it is like a space fantasy. It's oftentimes it's brutally realistic about, you know, the good and bad people on both sides of a war, of the good and bad things that they both do. On the, you know, it doesn't allow you to reduce anything down like simplistically. And so I think having just like even a complicated happily ever after would be out of step in some ways with the rest of the book. Because the reality of this and all wars is that, well, that's not the end, because now you've got a resentful, defeated party who is gearing up to try again. You know, like the end of World War One was a couple years of peace, and then World War Two as a direct result. You know, like that's just history. That's just the way that it works. So basically, I think that it's reflective of that priority of the books, to be political in a way that is realistic and resonant. Do I think that Disney told her that she had to do it? Yeah, probably. But, you know, it worked for me.
That's fair. I think that's fair. And then, of course, Qui-Gon Ben says it felt like we were setting up a sequel that we would never be given. And that's fair. But you know what? It hasn't even been 10 years. There could be a sequel. I'm not sure exactly what a sequel would look like.
Well, the sequel is the Captain Phasma book. That's what becomes of these people who are gearing up to become the First Order.
Well, yeah, but what happens to Thane and Sienna?
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying that, like, I think it doesn't have to be a Captain Marvel will return kind of setup for the next thing. It can be and this is what is going to happen next politically in the Star Wars universe, you know?
Yeah, that's fair. That is fair. And there definitely are books that have done that for sure, in similar fashions. But if there was a sequel, what would it be?
I don't think it would be interesting. Because I think that what happens next is that they become citizens of the New Republic, and however many years elapse. What year is it? 7 ABY is the Battle of Jakku?
I don't remember.
Well, you know, it's like several, maybe it's a couple years after the Battle of Yavin. We've gotten that. It's not until what? 30 ABY that the next war starts up, the next all out, like the destruction of the Hosnian system.
Yeah.
So I think that either they're in their 50s when the next book happens, and they're citizens of the New Republic, and then maybe they have to join back up, and then we're just getting another perspective on the sequels, which could be interesting. Or it's, you know, they live out their happy life, and then, like, I mean, like maybe they're living on one of those 20 planets that got exploded by the First Order. You know, like, I think that it would be interesting to have that. I think that there's something, and it's because I know why I have this bias. It's because I'm a young person. But I think that the idea of idealistic young people on the wrong side of a war is more interesting than people who have already been through a war and were the idealistic young people on the wrong side of it and are now middle-aged and are like, not this again. I think it would just be depressing.
Fair.
Because that's what makes the sequels operate, is the idealistic young people. You know, like Luke, Leia, Han, they've lived through this. They're mentors, but they're not the driving force.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point, and I think that the intensity of this novel and the way that they're torn apart and brought back together very in this tumultuous manner is what drives this story so completely. So you're right, it would be missing because they'd be on the same side, even if it was begrudging from one of the halves. But yeah, I'm satisfied with the ending for the most part, and I would love to know what Claudia Gray thinks happened to these characters, just for my own like shipping heart.
Yeah.
Um, but honestly, I think that's it. I think we did a good job of covering Lost Stars and our thoughts on it, the political intrigue and importance of this novel, as well as the love story that it tells. I have no further comments. I don't know about you, Hannah. Um,
Good book. Read
yes,
it. I did not read it for a long time, and I wish I'd read it sooner. Because
yes.
people were telling me, "Good book, read it," and I knew I would like it, and I just like didn't actually beat my executive dysfunction and go for it. And you should just go for it because it's a great book, and you shouldn't procrastinate reading it because it's now's a good time to read it, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% concur. Definitely one of my favorite Star Wars books that I've read. Unfortunately, guys, I haven't picked the next book, but I will be making an announcement probably sometime in December because I think we all want to break for the holidays. So I think our next book club will happen in January. But thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, please give this a big like. Hannah, do you want to plug anything or say where people can find you?
I'm still occasionally posting on TikTok under Discount Bo-Katan. That's where my Star Wars
Yay!
content is. Every once in a blue moon, I'll have something to say. And, maybe I'll talk about this book because now I'm fired up about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty to say for sure. Well, yes, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will be back sometime soon, hopefully. Maybe making some Skeleton Crew content, and you can go over to Yap Sesh, my podcast as well, where we're posting a new video this Thursday, and upcoming re-yaps for Skeleton Crew. But that is all that we have. Thank you for watching, and have a great night. Bye.